8 a.m., May 20th, 1941. New Zealand, Sergeant James Mackenzie stared into the morning sky over Crete and froze. What he witnessed would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his days. The entire sky darkened, not with clouds, but with people. Thousands of German Fallschirmjäger, their parachutes like white blossoms against the blue, were leaping from transport planes at a mere 400 feet. So low, Mackenzie could see their faces. So low that many died on impact. Before their parachutes fully deployed, he grabbed his rifle, aimed at the first paratrooper, and fired. The German plummeted, his parachute collapsing. Then came the next, and the next, and more, and more. Mackenzie would later write, "They fell like rain from hell, but no matter how many we shot down, they kept coming and coming." What began that morning over the Greek island of Crete wasn't just a battle. It was a plunge into collective death. The most audacious and bloody airborne operation in history, Operation Mercury, named after the Roman god of war. The British, Greeks, and New Zealanders awaited them with over 40,000 men. The initial German waves numbered only 3,000 Fallschirmjäger, a mathematical impossibility, a tactical suicide. Yet, 12 days later, the swastika flag flew over Crete, and Allied commanders wrote in their reports about something they'd never witnessed before. A determination that defied all military logic, a will stronger than the fear of certain death. This is the story of how 1,000 German Fallschirmjäger jumped against 10,000 defenders, how they lost half their comrades in the opening hours, how they continued to fight regardless, and how, in doing so, they forced the Allied commanders to acknowledge the impossible. These are the minutes, the decisions, the human moments that forever changed a strategic island. And the course of the war. By the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Europe. Poland had fallen. France had surrendered. The Soviet Union unknowingly awaited the coming storm. Only one strategic gap remained in the German grip, the Eastern Mediterranean. And there, like a forgotten emerald between Greece and North Africa, lay Crete, 160 miles long, ravaged by mountains, steeped in millennia of history. And now, in May 1941, the key to the entire Mediterranean. For the British, Crete was a natural fortress. 3 airfields, Maleme in the west, Rethymno in the center, Heraklion in the east, each guarded by thousands of soldiers. Steep cliffs ringed the coastlines. Narrow mountain passes made any invasion from the sea difficult. General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the defenders, a New Zealander who had won more medals in World War I than he was years old, looked at his maps and smiled. The Germans would have to come from the sea, and then his men would throw them back into the water. His artillery was positioned. His 40,000 men were ready. Crete was, in his own words, a death trap for any attacker. What Freyberg didn't know was that the Germans weren't planning to come by sea. They would fall from the sky. Back in Germany, in the barracks of the 7th Air Division and the 5th Mountain Division, men were preparing for something the world had never seen. A complete conquest of an island solely by air. No naval support, no tank reinforcements in the initial days, only Fallschirmjäger and gliders. General Kurt Student, father of the German airborne troops, had been developing this plan for months. He knew his men would be outnumbered. He knew the losses could be devastating. But he believed in something no statistic could measure: the superiority of German Fallschirmjäger training. The determination of men who volunteered to jump from airplanes into battle. The Fallschirmjäger weren't ordinary soldiers. Every single one was a volunteer. Each had survived months of the most intense training. They jumped with minimal equipment. Their weapons were dropped in separate containers. This meant they landed practically unarmed, had to find their containers, arm themselves, all under enemy fire. It was a doctrine born from desperation and audacity. And they would test it to the last man on Crete. Fallschirmjäger training lasted 6 months, longer than almost any other infantry unit. First came the standard basic training, then parachute school in Stendal or Wittstock. There, the recruits learned to jump from towers, from low-flying aircraft, again and again, until the jump became a reflex, until the fear, if it didn't disappear, at least became controllable. Of 100 recruits who started, about 70 made it to the end. The others dropped out or were weeded out, too slow, too afraid, not determined enough. The Fallschirmjäger wanted only the best. Those who made it through wore their grey uniforms with pride. The Fallschirmjäger badge, a stylized eagle in a dive, was sewn onto their chests. It meant more than just a qualification. It meant you belonged to the elite. That you were willing to jump from an airplane into the unknown. That, if necessary, you could fight alone behind enemy lines. The Fallschirmjäger called themselves the Green Devils. The Allies would later give them other names. On May 19, 1941, the day before the attack, the Fallschirmjäger gathered at airfields in Greece and Bulgaria. Private First Class Ethan Weber, 22 years old, from Munich, wrote his last letter home. He would never mail it. Captain Walter Koch, a veteran of the capture of Fort Eben Emael in Belgium, inspected his men and saw no fear in their eyes, only determination. Or perhaps, he thought later, simply acceptance. They all knew what was coming. The briefings had minced no words. At least 30% casualties were expected in the first hours, but they were Fallschirmjäger, and Fallschirmjäger always jumped. May 20th, 1941, 5:30 a.m. The Junkers Ju-52 transport planes roared to life. Their triple engines thundered across the Greek airfields. One after another they taxied to the runway. In their bellies sat men, tightly packed, parachutes on their backs, helmets on their heads. Some prayed quietly, others simply stared ahead. No one spoke. What was left to say? 7:15 a.m. The first formations reached Crete. Hundreds of Ju-52s like a swarm of mechanical birds. British flak opened fire immediately. Black clouds of smoke erupted amongst the aircraft. A Junkers Ju-52 was hit, exploded in mid-air. The men inside stood no chance. Another burst into flames, spiraling, smoking into the sea. But the formation flew on, ever onward. 0800 hours, the green light inside the planes illuminated. Jump command. The Fallschirmjäger stood, hooked up their static line, and at the command of their jump masters, they leaped, one after another, seconds apart, from a mere 400 feet. Why so low? Because German strategists feared that higher jumps would leave the men in the air too long as targets. What they failed to consider, at 400 feet, the parachutes barely had time to open. Some men slammed into the ground with half-opened chutes, their bones shattering on impact. Others landed in olive trees, hanging helplessly, while enemy bullets tore through them. Still others fell directly onto rocks. Instant death. Sergeant Mackenzie, the New Zealand defender, poured machine gun fire into the sky from his Bren gun. His ammunition box emptied in minutes. He reloaded, fired again. Around him, thousands of others did the same. The sky was a hail of gunfire, and the Germans fell like cut flowers. But for every one who fell, 2 more landed. They hit the ground, rolled, ran to their weapons containers, armed themselves, and began to return fire. The Fallschirmjäger landed in a chaos that no training could have prepared them for. Private First Class Ethan Weber jumped from his Junkers Ju-52. His parachute opened with a jolt, and in the next moment, a bullet whizzed past his head. He looked down and realized he was landing directly on top of a New Zealand machine gun nest. He could see the faces of the gunners. He could see the muzzle flashes of their weapons, pointed right at him. There was no escape. He was a target in the air. Then, 10 yards from the ground, a bullet tore through his left thigh. Another pierced his parachute. He hit hard, right next to a dead comrade. His leg burned. Blood seeped through his trousers, but he was alive. He dragged himself behind a rock, found a weapons container, ripped it open, pulled out an MP-40 submachine gun, charged it, and fired at the machine gun nest that had almost killed him. The New Zealanders returned fire. Weber crawled on, found a trench, and dropped into it. 3 other Fallschirmjäger were already there. 1 was dead, 1 wounded. The third, a private first class named Schmidt, looked at Weber and simply said, "Welcome to Crete." They remained in that trench for 4 hours, unable to move, wedged between 2 New Zealand positions. They could see their dead comrades, scattered all around them. White parachutes marked their bodies like grim flags. The heat was unbearable. No water. Weber's leg wound continued to bleed. Schmidt, who was uninjured, tried to apply a bandage, but they had no medical equipment. Everything was in the containers, somewhere out there, unreachable. All they could do was wait and survive. The opening hours of the battle for Crete were a bloodbath. The Fallschirmjäger, who landed west of Maleme Airfield, were met by New Zealand battalions, who had been waiting for them for days. The New Zealanders knew every field, every olive grove, every stone. The Germans landed scattered, disoriented, stripped of half their containers. Yet they rallied, in small groups, under whatever NCO had happened to survive. And they attacked. Captain Walter Koch landed east of Maleme with his assault group, his mission to knock out the anti-aircraft batteries south of the airfield. He gathered 60 men from an original 120. The others were dead or wounded. With these 60, he stormed the fortified positions. The New Zealanders fired from trenches. Germans fell. Their comrades leapt over their bodies, ran on. Koch reached the first flak position, threw a hand grenade inside, jumped in after it. Hand-to-hand combat, bayonets, screams. When the smoke cleared, the position belonged to the Germans. Koch had 35 men left, but the anti-aircraft guns were silent. At Maleme Airfield itself, the 3 Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3 landed directly under the guns of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion. The battalion commander, Colonel Stenzler, jumped from his Junkers Ju-52 and was struck by 3 bullets. While still in the air, he was dead before he hit the ground. His second-in-command, Captain Gericke, landed in a river and drowned under the weight of his equipment. The 3 Battalion lost 65% of its officers in 15 minutes, but the surviving NCOs took over. They rallied their men. They attacked. What the New Zealanders saw in those moments, they later described with a mixture of horror and respect. One defender, Private Tommy Jones, wrote, "They ran straight into our fire. We cut them down, but the ones behind just kept coming. No cover, no pause, just on and on." It was as if they didn't understand that they could die, or as if they didn't care. What Jones didn't understand, the Fallschirmjäger had no choice. Behind them was nothing, no retreat, no reinforcement. Their only way was forward, to the airfield, because only if they captured the airfield could transport planes land with reinforcements and heavy weapons. Without the airfield, they were doomed, and they knew it. Midday, May 20th. The situation for the Fallschirmjäger was desperate. Of the 3,000 men of the first wave, at least 1,200 were dead or severely wounded. The survivors held scattered positions, surrounded by enemy troops. Ammunition was running low. Water was scarce. The midday heat of Crete beat down on them. Wounded screamed for medics who were not there. The dead lay everywhere, their parachutes spread over them like white shrouds. General Bernhard Freiberg, the Allied commander, read the reports from his frontline commanders and smiled. The German invasion had failed. His men had repelled every attack. Maleme Airfield was firmly in his hands. The Germans, he wrote to his headquarters, are finished. We will throw them into the sea tomorrow. But Freiberg overlooked something small, something that would prove to be decisive. South of Maleme Airfield, on a hill called Hill 107, lay the crucial position. From this hill, the entire runway could be surveyed. Whoever controlled Hill 107 controlled the airfield. The 22nd New Zealand Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew held this position. All day long, his men had fought off the German attacks. But then, as night fell, something happened that no one expected. Communication between Andrew and his headquarters was severed. German artillery, hastily manned by Fallschirmjäger, shelled Hill 107 all afternoon. Andrew lost man after man. His ammunition was running dangerously low. Worse still, he believed that German reinforcements had landed. This was incorrect, but in the confusion and chaos of battle, he believed it. And on the night of May 20th, Andrew made a decision that would decide the battle. He ordered a withdrawal from Hill 107. As the morning of May 21st dawned, the German paratroopers saw something they hadn't dared to hope for. The New Zealand positions on Hill 107 were abandoned. Captain Gens, who had been holding out in an olive grove with 40 surviving Fallschirmjäger, couldn't believe it. He sent out scouts. They came back. The hill is clear. Gens rounded up every man he could find. Wounded men dragged themselves along. Men without weapons carried ammunition. With about 80 Fallschirmjäger, all that remained of his original battalion, Gens seized Hill 107, and with that, the Maleme Airfield was open. General Student, commander of Operation Mercury in Crete, read the news and acted immediately. Every available Junkers Ju-52 was loaded, not with paratroopers, with mountain troopers from the 5th Mountain Division. Heavily armed, better suited for frontline combat, the transport planes took off, one after another, formation after formation. They flew across the Mediterranean, their pilots knowing the Maleme runway was still under enemy fire, but they flew anyway. May 21st. Afternoon, the first Junkers Ju-52s began their approach to land at Maleme. The New Zealanders, who had retreated south, fired with everything they had. The first Ju-52 touched down, rolled to a stop. Its doors burst open, and mountain troopers leaped out. Seconds later, a mortar shell exploded next to the plane. It erupted in flames. The pilots were dead, but the mountain troopers were already scrambling for cover. The second Ju-52 landed. Bullets riddled its wings. It shuddered to a halt. More men poured out. The third Ju-52 was hit before it could land. It crashed at the end of the runway, exploding, killing everyone on board. But the landings continued, plane after plane. Many were destroyed. Their burning wrecks littered the runway. Pilots died in their seats. But for every plane destroyed, 2 more landed, and each one brought 12 mountain troopers. By the end of May 21st, more than 600 mountain troopers had reached Maleme. The Fallschirmjäger, reinforced, attacked again, this time with heavy machine guns, with mortars, with something they didn't have on the first day: hope. General Bernhard Freiberg realized too late what had happened. He ordered a counterattack on Maleme, but his troops were exhausted, their ammunition was low, and the Germans now firmly controlled the airfield. The battle, which had begun on May 20th as a German nightmare, turned on May 21st. Slowly, bloody, but inexorably. In the following days, thousands of German reinforcements landed at Maleme. At the same time, German Fallschirmjäger continued to fight for the other airfields, Rethymno and Heraklion, but those battles were lost. The Fallschirmjäger there were surrounded. Their losses were devastating. Of the 1,200 Fallschirmjäger at Rethymno, less than 300 survived the battle uninjured. Many were captured. In Heraklion, it was even worse. The British and Greek defenders fought with a ferocity that knew no quarter. Fallschirmjäger who surrendered were often shot. Wounded men were bayoneted. It was war in its most brutal form, but with Maleme in German hands, the strategic outcome was decided. The Allies could no longer win. Their own air support was non-existent. German Stukas bombed every troop movement. German reinforcements poured in daily through Maleme. On May 26th, General Freiberg ordered a retreat. His troops were to withdraw across the mountains to the south coast, where the Royal Navy would evacuate them. The retreat across the mountains of Crete was its own hell. Thousands of Allied soldiers, many wounded, scrambled over steep mountain paths. No roads, no water, no food. German planes hunted them. Fallschirmjäger pursued them. Many simply surrendered out of exhaustion. By June 1st, 1941, the Battle of Crete was over. The Germans had won. But at what cost? Of the roughly 8,000 German Fallschirmjäger who took part in Operation Mercury, more than 4,000 were killed or wounded, a casualty rate of 50%. Entire battalions were wiped out. The 3 Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 3 lost 75% of its men in the first 24 hours. Companies that jumped with 120 men counted 30 survivors at the end. The hospitals in Greece were overflowing with wounded. Entire Junkers Ju-52 formations had been annihilated. Of 500 transport planes deployed, more than 150 were destroyed or damaged. When Adolf Hitler read the report on Operation Mercury, he was appalled. The losses were unacceptable. He ordered, "Never again a major operation with Fallschirmjäger. Never again." The German Fallschirmjäger force, elite unit and pride of the Luftwaffe, would fight as infantry for the rest of the war. Crete was their first and last major airborne victory, and it amounted to a Pyrrhic victory. The Allies drew other lessons from Crete. The British and Americans saw what was possible with airborne troops. They saw the mistakes the Germans made: too low jumps, lack of heavy equipment, no simultaneous naval support. And they began to build their own airborne forces. Troops who would jump in Normandy and at Market Garden 3 years later. Crete was the textbook. The Germans had written it in their blood. The New Zealand and British defenders spoke with respect, sometimes with horror, about their German opponents. Colonel Howard Kippenberger, commander of the New Zealand forces, wrote after the war, "I fought in World War I. I fought in North Africa. But I never saw soldiers run with such determination into certain death as the German Fallschirmjäger on Crete. It was courageous to the point of self-destruction, but it was courageous nonetheless." In a British intelligence report, declassified only in 1992, an officer describes the initial reaction to the Fallschirmjäger. "We thought they would surrender as soon as they realized how hopeless their situation was. They were surrounded, outnumbered, without heavy weapons. Every military logic dictated that they surrender, but they didn't surrender. They rallied, they organized, and they attacked, again and again. It was as if surrender wasn't even an option for them, as if they'd rather fight to the last man than give up, and many did just that." A Greek partisan, Michael Papadakis, who as a 16-year-old watched the battle, recalled 60 years later, "We hated the Germans. They were invaders. They were destroying our homeland. But when we saw them falling from the sky, dying even before they hit the ground, how they continued to fight anyway, we couldn't help but feel a certain awe. These were no cowards. These were warriors, terrible warriors, but warriors. Even General Bernhard Freyberg, whose troops lost the battle, wrote in a private letter to his wife, "The German paratroopers fought with a bravery that deserves every praise. They jumped into hell and fought their way through. I wish we had such men." He would later regret that sentence when the letter was discovered by censors, but he never recanted it. A British prisoner, Captain Ryan Forrester, was guarded by German paratroopers after the battle. He later described them. They were boys, most no older than 20, emaciated, exhausted, many wounded, but there was something in their eyes that I can't describe. Pride, maybe. Or simply the realization that they had survived what no one should have survived. Decades after the battle, veterans from both sides were brought together on Crete. Reconciliation ceremonies. Old men who had once tried to kill each other shook hands. A New Zealander veteran, Trevor Williams, embraced a German paratrooper veteran, Fritz Schaumburg. Williams said, "We did our duty. You did yours. We all lost. Our comrades remained." Schaumburg, tears in his eyes, who could only nod. On Crete today, there are memorials to the fallen on both sides. The German war cemetery in Maleme, on Hill 107, contains the graves of more than 4,400 German dead, row upon row of white crosses, on the hill for which they died. The inscriptions are simple: name, age, date. Many are simply marked "Unknown German Soldier." Their families never learned where they were buried. The British and New Zealander cemeteries are similarly silent. Thousands of young men from countries on the other side of the world lie beneath the Greek sun. They died for an island whose name many couldn't pronounce before they were sent there. The Cretan civilians also suffered terrible losses. Hundreds, maybe thousands, were killed by German troops, often in retaliation for partisan attacks. Entire villages were burned to the ground. The Cretan population fought the invaders with hunting rifles, pitchforks, bare hands. Their bravery was indescribable, their losses equally so. Crete 1941 wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of soldiers doing their duty in a war they didn't start, of decisions made in seconds that cost thousands of lives, of human courage that knows no nationality. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths matter to you, then support with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Each Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing last living witnesses. Help me preserve this story for generations to come. The tactical lessons from Crete echoed for decades. The Germans had proven that a massive airborne operation was possible, but also that it was only feasible with astronomical losses. The Allies absorbed these lessons and developed better tactics, higher jump altitudes, better weapon transport methods, coordinated naval support. When American paratroopers jumped over Normandy in 1944, they did so with equipment and tactics learned directly from the mistakes of Crete. The human stories, however, were universal. Captain Walter Koch, who had taken the flak positions on the first day, survived Crete. He later fought in Russia and Italy. He died in 1944, not in combat, but in a plane crash on the way back from the front. Fritz Schaumburg, the young paratrooper from the 30 Battalion, survived the battle badly wounded. He lost a leg. He returned to Germany, married, had children. Until his death in 2003, He never spoke about Crete with his family. Too painful, too many dead comrades. On the Allied side, Sergeant James Mackenzie survived. He later fought in North Africa and Italy. He was wounded at Cassino and sent back to New Zealand. After the war, he worked as a sheep farmer. Every May 20th, until his death in 1998, he didn't go to work that day. His family knew why. It was the day the sky turned dark. The historical archives on both sides are full of details of the battle. German war diaries describe the minutes before the jump, the silence in the plane, the roar of the engines, the green light, the moment of the jump, then the chaos, the fire, the death. British and New Zealander accounts describe the defense, the hope that they could hold, the despair as more and more Germans landed, the decision to retreat. New research, based on recently declassified documents, reveals details that were hidden for decades. British intelligence reports had predicted the German invasion. They had correctly identified the landing zones. But the warnings reached the front too late, or were ignored. The decision by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew to evacuate Hill 107 was controversially discussed after the war. Was it a mistake or a necessary decision given his situation? Historians debate to this day. What isn't disputed is the bravery on both sides. The Germans jumping into fire from 400 feet, the New Zealanders meeting them with iron determination. The Greeks fighting paratroopers with hunting rifles, the British defending their positions to the last bullet. All were soldiers. All were doing their duty. They all bled. The strategic consequences of the battle were far-reaching. Crete in German hands meant control over the eastern Mediterranean. British convoys had to take long detours around Africa. The planned German attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was delayed by weeks because of the losses in Crete. Some historians argue that this delay was decisive, that the Wehrmacht would have reached Moscow if they had attacked in May instead of June, that Crete, therefore, indirectly contributed to the victory of the Soviet Union. Others disagree. The debate continues. What remains are the stories, the human moments in an inhuman war, the Fallschirmjäger who landed next to his best friend, who was already dead before his parachute opened. The New Zealand defender who gave a wounded German water, even though his officer forbade it. The Cretan farmer who hid wounded British soldiers in his cellar at the risk of being shot by the Germans. The German medic who ran under fire to save a wounded New Zealander and was killed himself. These are the moments that reveal the true nature of war. Not the propaganda, not the flags and parades, but the blood, the fear, the bravery, the humanity that can flicker even in hell. Today, Crete is a tourist island. Beaches, hotels, history turned into souvenirs. But if you know where to look, you can see the scars, the old bunkers, overgrown, the bullet holes in stone walls, the cemeteries, silent under the sun. And if you listen to the old Cretans, the few who are still alive, who experienced the battle as children, you hear stories that are never in history books, of families that disappeared, of houses that burned, of children who had to grow up in a single day in May. The lesson of Crete is not that war is glorious, but that it is terrible, that bravery is not enough, that victory is expensive, and that the cost is paid by those who had the least choice. The German Fallschirmjäger of 1941 are almost all dead. The last veterans died in the 2010s. With them died the last eyewitness accounts. What remains are archives, historians, and stories like these that try to preserve what happened. What impressed you the most? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories, grandfathers who were there, letters found in attics, war diaries that survived generations. Share your family history from this time below. Every comment is a piece of history that we can preserve together.